Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to Simeon as well for the invitation. The title that I'm working to is ambiguous. It's Can Europe Manage Structural Reform? There are two possible interpretations of that question. Can it succeed in doing so, or is it able to organize the task effectively? I'm going to concentrate on the latter question, because we seem to take it for granted that Europe can give the right kind of signals, but as many of you in Greece will know, that's not always necessarily the case. And in this context, I do want to quote to you the first and second laws of economists. The first law of economists is that for every economist, there exists an equal and opposite economist. And the second law of economists is they're both wrong. You need to bear this in mind when talking about structural reforms, as I'm sure Paul will be explaining shortly. Let's therefore look at the instruments of managing economic reform from the European level. We have, as many of you will be very familiar, the semester. The semester, in fact, lasts a year, so it's already an odd expression to use, a 6-month, year-long process, in which we have an annual exercise aimed at trying to work out what individual member states should do. There are prescriptions put forward for it. We have something called the country-specific recommendations, which are the culmination of the process every year, decanted down to the member state level. And we have, in some respects, a strange dialogue, which a former colleague and co-author of Agnès' Jean Pisani-Ferry has described as Brussels speaking to Brussels, because it doesn't quite connect with member state debates. We then have a massive infrastructure of policy making around rules. Rules for fiscal policy, I don't need to explain those to anybody in Greece, but also something called the macroeconomic imbalances procedure, which is also rules-based, and various other things about submitting national budgets. And then we have an attempt overall to articulate ways in which the nature of policy is set up at European level. So there is, in the background, a European economic model of what the appropriate form of structural change should be. Well, what's the evidence when you start to look at this? The first is that we have shortcomings in the analysis. Lucas Tsoukalis this morning referred to Ohio, the own house in order approach to managing things. I've been trying to work on an alternative. I was trying to get something with collective action in it, and I came up with Canada. Collective action, negotiating away debt arrangements. But that's a bit too convoluted. So we need to think of something about collective action as the alternative to Ohio. The country-specific recommendations, if you look at some of the studies that have been done of them, have a very low compliance rate. Brussels issues an edict to Denmark, to the United Kingdom, to certain other countries, even sometimes to Greece, and the member state governments either reject it completely, do the opposite, because that plays well in national politics, or do nothing, which is a way of saying that the country-specific recommendations simply are not respected. In another area of reform, we do know that there's supposed to be all these reforms of euro area governance leading to a more strict application of fiscal discipline. And yet at the first big test in the summer of 2016, what happened was that Portugal and Spain were found to be in breach of the Stability and Growth Pact, not to have any excuse to be in such breach, so they didn't qualify for any of the escape clauses, and therefore they were liable for fines. And the solution, probably brokered by Thomas, was to fine them €0. The financial sanction at the first time of testing didn't work. Not guilty, okay. I'm very glad to hear it. The macroeconomic imbalances procedure has a whole range of indicators which member states are tested on. For example, how fast are house prices rising or falling? How big is your balance of payments deficit or surplus? It's already asymmetric because the surplus that's supposed to be an imbalance is 6% of GDP, and the deficit that constitutes a balance is only 4%. What do you find as the outcome? Well, I probably don't need to tell you that Germany has a surplus of 8% of GDP, tending towards 9%. The Netherlands similarly. Sweden has such a big surplus, and certain other parts of the Eurozone have deficits. In fact, the big deficit country at the moment is the UK with 5%. On the basis of that indicator alone, let alone all the other indicators, you'd think Germany should be deemed to have a macroeconomic imbalance, that the UK should have a different kind of macroeconomic imbalance. And yet, in 2016 and 2017, the verdict on the UK was no imbalances. Now, I'm not trying to say this is the right economics. What I'm trying to say is when you have this European process and it's undermined at every stage, you have to question whether it's effective management of the procedure. No action is taken. And this leads me at least, to worry that you have this huge superstructure of trying to manage structural reform from the European level with very little coming out at the end of it. Is there a way around this? Well, this is where I will try to be a bit more constructive and say that there is something of an instinct in Brussels to refine and recalibrate as the way of dealing with such problems. So if it's the fiscal rules, you adjust the fiscal rules. If it's the macroeconomic imbalances procedure, you add new indicators. You don't say, is this a correct approach in the first place? And many that I've spoken to in the course of recent research think the macroeconomic imbalances procedure really is a dead letter. It isn't going to be effective at any point because no member state will really comply with it. And if that's the case, trying to use that as the instrument for promoting structural reform isn't going to work. What this tells us as well is that the challenge very often at European level is not designing the systems, is not getting the right sorts of incentives in them, it's implementation. Implementation doesn't follow the way the things are set up. Is there therefore an alternative? My alternative is revert to national responsibility. If you make the member states far more responsible to their own constituencies, I hesitate to use the word because it's horrible, but it's true, ownership is the solution to this. And if that starts to happen, you are more likely to get this working. Now, rules can play some part in it, but it need to be rules that are owned by the national level, that are implemented by the national level. And if you have that, you have a far greater likelihood of things changing positively. I'll leave you with a quote from Mark Twain, who, as you know, is a great repository of wonderful quotes. 20 years from now, you will be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the ones you did do. Explore, dream, discover. Thank you.